All right, let's take our Bibles, if you would, and turn to Genesis chapter 42. All right, starting up here on the screen, it says in Genesis 39:19, when Potiphar heard his wife's story, especially when she said, "That is what your slave did to me," he became very angry. So Joseph's master arrested him and put him in the same prison where the king's prisoners were kept. Mistreatment. We all know what it's like to be mistreated, but uh, this way, Joseph is going along and suddenly sold by his brothers in the middle of a desert to some strangers going to Egypt. And then later he's put in prison for refusing sexual temptation. This is mistreatment on a level most of us have no idea about. And he is an excellent example of a person to study on how to be mistreated and respond the right way and grow strong through it. That's what he did. Now, how could Joseph have responded? We have in the Bible what God tells us, but how could he have responded? If you look up common ways that people react to being mistreated, my goodness. Of course, one of the first ones is bitterness, anger, revenge, rage. I'm going to get that person back for what they did to me. That could have easily been what he was like. There's also then kind of the opposite, which is depression, which is folding up in sadness and hopelessness because you've been hurt and there's no way around it. There's no way to get back what you lost, and you just give up. Then there's anxiety, which is I'm afraid this is going to happen again to me. They'll be mistreated again, and so now I'm in fear and worry about it. And then people who have these feelings, typical ways of coping with having those feelings is number one, substance abuse, alcohol, drugs, using these in a way to numb the bad feelings that you have. Eating disorders come from this root, trying to cope with feeling bad. Self-harm is another way to be able to try to deal with the pain. And social isolation. I was hurt by getting involved with people, so I just won't get involved with people. I'll pull out, pull back, and not allow anyone to hurt me anymore. All these are really common ways for people to respond to being mistreated. But we see Joseph taking none of these. None of these are taken by Joseph. Certainly he struggled. Certainly there were behind the scenes things going on that we aren't privy to in the Bible. But what we do know he did, he made two amazing choices that turned all this horrible experience that he had into making his life strong and taking this terrible thing and redeeming it because of two choices that he made. We've been looking at how people in the Bible responded to the different hardships that they go through to learn from their examples. And last week we started looking at Joseph and what his responses were as he was initially mistreated by his brothers. And if you remember, there were four things that we saw him do, life skills that we can learn from. And I don't know, maybe you were able to put some of these into practice this week. Number one, there was become the best you can be for God where you are. When you can't control things, God isn't changing things. God says, bloom where you're planted. Become the best you can be where you are. The second thing we saw him do was give credit to God when he had success. When he became the best he was recognized for it, and he gave credit to God. Don't forget to do that for yourself first. This wasn't because of what I did. If I had not been blessed by God, what I did wouldn't have made any difference. But then also let the people know. And then third, look out for temptation after having success. Satan hates it when you give credit to God for his success, so he'll land on you with both feet, and that's what happened to Joseph. And then the fourth thing we learned was be prepared to pay the price for resisting temptation. Satan's going to land on you. You do the right thing, but you'll likely pay for it. All these things Joseph went through, and they were key to his taking a bad situation and growing strong through it, which is what you and I want to do. We don't want to have a bad situation and grow weaker through it and have our lives, just kind of fall apart. That's way too common in this world. God says, I brought this and said yes to it, given permission to it to be in your life so that you move up. It's not easy, but you move up. So today we're going to look at two more life skills that he practiced, in particular in response to his brothers mistreating him. What did he do in the light of this terrible mistreatment? And as I said, there's no doubt that you've been mistreated. All of us have been mistreated in this life. Maybe you can think of a time you were mistreated or a person who mistreated you. Maybe it's still going on. And just the thought of it is hard to bring to your mind. You're not alone. There are people in this room the same way. They've been mistreated and have a hard time thinking about it. Joseph certainly was mistreated. And I don't think we can begin to imagine the anguish of being separated from his family, taken to a foreign country, enslaved. Just the worst situation. But this morning, we're going to learn 2 life skills from his life for growing strong in hardship. If that describes something you need, listen up closely. If maybe you're not really going through anything particularly hard right now, listen up for someone else's sake. Someone you know is going through hardship. And perhaps God would give you these words of comfort and help today to be able to share and pass on to them. So let's look at 2 life skills from Joseph's life for growing strong in mistreatment. Last week, we left Joseph in jail after refusing to commit adultery with Potiphar's wife. And then there follows quite a long series of events that go on there in jail and afterwards. And our purpose this morning isn't to go through the life of Joseph. It's to focus upon how he dealt with his brother's mistreatment. So we're going to fast forward through this. He's there in prison. If you remember, he interprets the dreams of 2 of the prisoners. One of them goes and then goes back into Pharaoh's palace where Pharaoh has a dream that needs interpreting. They can't find anyone. Joseph is called up from prison. Joseph interprets Pharaoh's dream. If you remember, it was that there was going to be 7 years of plenty coming along for Egypt, followed by 7 years of just nothing. And Joseph suggests, why don't you set aside 1/5 of everything that comes in during the 7 good years so you'll have plenty to eat during the 7 years of bad. And Joseph impresses Pharaoh so much that he immediately puts him in charge of the project and makes him the second in charge in Egypt. So imagine he goes to bed one night, a slave in a prison cell. The next evening, he is the second in charge of the most powerful superpower in the world. Just a crazy story, crazy. Joseph spends the next 7 years preparing, gathering all the grain he can. Then the famine hits, and everybody in Egypt comes to him. They get food, and not only in Egypt, but outside of Egypt, people here, we're experiencing the famine too. Where can we find food? I hear there's food down in Egypt. And so they go. And that brings us to chapter 42. Look at 42, verse 1. Now Jacob saw that there was grain in Egypt, and Jacob said to his sons, why are you staring at one another? And he said, behold, I have heard there is grain in Egypt. Go down there and buy some for us from that place, that we may live and not die. And then 10 brothers of Joseph went down to buy grain from Egypt. So the 10 brothers of Egypt of Joseph set off for Egypt. Jump down to verse 6. Now Joseph was the ruler over the land. He was the one who sold to all the people of the land. And Joseph's brothers came and bowed down to him with their faces to the ground. Imagine what was going through Joseph's mind. He'd had that dream way early in his life where his brothers bow down before him, his father and mother bow down before him, and here it is, right in front of him. His dream fulfilled. He recognized their shepherd's clothing and scraggly beards. They did not recognize him in his royal robes and his speaking Egyptian. He would have been clean shaven like all the other Egyptians, so they don't know who he is. He immediately knows who they are. And what do you think is going through his mind? Rage, anger, fierce temptation to get back at them. Certainly those things were going through his mind. The last time he saw them, they were incredibly wicked men. They betrayed him. Were they still that way? Were they still betraying and being cruel and wicked to other people? Had they changed when they may be different men? Well, a series of events goes on where he tests them to find out what they were really like at the moment. And again, we're not going to go into the details there. But after a long series of events, ultimately he learns they had changed. They had been the most wicked of men, but they had changed. And before we go on, let me just say that tells us to never give up on anyone. Never give up on anyone. If God could change these men, he can change anybody. These were some of the worst in the Bible. Some of them once slaughtered all the men, all the innocent men of a whole town, just because one of the men had raped their sister. They go in, they wipe out the entire male population. That's wickedness. These were the same guys who were so intensely hated Joseph that they were ready to kill him in the desert. And then later on, they all lied to their father about what happened to him, which nearly killed their father. And then they all hid their wickedness for 20 years or so, the time that they were separated. But God changed these men. God changed these men. And you might know someone in your family who you feel there's no way they're ever going to accept God. Don't stop praying for them. God changes hearts. And you may know someone at work who is just the most godless person you've ever met, and you can't imagine they would ever come to Christ. Don't stop praying for them. God is in the business of changing hearts. He changed these men's hearts, and he can change the hearts of the people that you are concerned about. Don't stop. As long as there is breath in them, there's hope. So this is just a small lesson in all this that we learn from this. God is in the business of changing hearts, and he did this in this case. He can do it for the person you're concerned about. Don't give up on them. Well, if you'll want to take your Bibles and turn to chapter 45, we're going to read a couple of verses there as we continue to move forward in Joseph's story. Chapter 45, Joseph is standing before his brothers, and it's at the end of this long process, and he's unable to take it anymore. It says in 45, verse 1, "Then Joseph could not control himself before all those who stood by him, and he cried, 'Have everyone go out from me.' And so there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. And he wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it." What do you imagine his brothers were thinking? I think probably what first happened was denial. Like, how in the world could you know about Joseph? Who told you about Joseph and that we did this? I would imagine that would be the first response. What kind of game are you playing with us here? But look at verse 4. Jump down to verse 4. "Then Joseph said to his brothers, 'Please come closer to me.' And they came closer. And he said, 'I am your brother Joseph, who you sold into Egypt.'" And I think at this point now it's dawning on them, this is the same brother. They're out of denial, and now they're into what? Terror? This is the most powerful man in all Egypt. He is the Lord of all Egypt right under Pharaoh. In fact, it said Pharaoh had turned over everything to him. And he is the one they betrayed in the desert. And now he has all power, and he's right before them. That would have been terrifying. He could do anything he wants. And sensing their terror, look what he says to them. Verse 5. "Do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here. For God sent me before you to preserve life. For the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by this great deliverance. Now therefore, it is not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and Lord of all his household, and rule over all the land of Egypt." How many people in Joseph's position would enjoy just paying back these brothers for the evil that they did? It would be so easy. Literally. Not figuratively, literally, with a snap of his fingers, Joseph could cause his brothers to all be sold into slavery, spread throughout all the kingdom there, separated from them, separated from their families and their children, to forever just be in this dark hole of a place of slavery, and then transfer them, when he wanted to a prison where they would suffer there. There was no question. It wasn't that was completely possible. and he had the power. Would you have been able to resist doing something back? Would I have been able to resist doing something back to them? What is incredibly amazing is the opening words of verse 5. This is really the first time he's speaking to them. He's revealed himself. Now, what are the first words that are going to come out of his mouth? His opening words shows he's concerned about two things. Look at verse 5. Do not be grieved, number 1, or angry, number 2, with yourselves because you sold me. Do not be grieved. I'm concerned about that. And do not be angry with yourselves for selling me. That's his first words to his brother. Imagine someone breaks into your house today while we're here at church, and they purposely burn it to the ground, and everything you love is gone, all your memories are gone, the provision is gone, and now you have nothing, and you have all this loss. And then you meet them afterwards, and you say to them, I don't want you to be grieved or angry with yourself for burning down my house. Would you do that? That is not natural. That is not what a normal person would do. Joseph is doing this. How in the world could he be concerned about them when all that they did to him? Well, we don't have to guess. He tells us why. 3 different times he tells us why. Verse 5, God sent me. Verse 7, God sent me before you. Verse 8, it was not you, but God who sent me. This gives us the first life skill for growing strong after mistreatment. Write this down in your insert. God chose, or rather, here's the answer. Choose hope for the future that sees God working it for good. Choose hope for the future that sees God working it for good. What was Joseph's response after being mistreated? Choosing hope for the future that saw God was working it for good. The natural thing for Joseph to do was to blame his brothers for sending him to Egypt. Of course he would do that. That's not what he did. Instead, he says, God did this, not you. God did this, not you. God did this, not you. 3 times he says that. Did Joseph have God's promise of Romans 8:28? We do. God works all things together for good. Did he have that promise? Nope. But he claimed it. He lived by it. He did not believe that his brothers were responsible. He said God was responsible, working it for good. His brothers had wickedly betrayed him. And he says, but no, God was working this perfectly for good. And that allowed him to view everything that had happened to him in the right light, in a light that let him cope with it. And this certainly would have happened long before this day that he's meeting with them. It may have easily started as he's in Potiphar's house as a slave, scrubbing floors. Instead of saying, my brothers did this to me, he's saying, God is working this for good, for a reason. God has brought me here for a reason. And later on, he's thrown into the prison, and he's in a dark jail cell for doing nothing wrong. And he's not blaming Potiphar's wife. He's saying, God has brought me here for a reason. God has brought me here for a reason. And it helped him cope with all that was going on. Greatly helped him cope. Seeing that by faith is what helped him cope and be able to meet his brothers and not want to harm them. It says in Psalm 119:75, I know, O Lord, that your decisions are right, and that in faithfulness you have afflicted. He knew that God was behind it, and that God was doing this for a faithful reason, and that helped him. Now, does that mean that God caused his brothers to sell him as a slave? I need Joseph down there. I'm going to cause these guys to do that. No, absolutely not. The Bible's very clear about that. This is what we've talked about before as the sinless use of sinful acts. The sinless use of sinless acts. What that means is, here you have a person who initiates evil, and God doesn't stop it because it harmonizes with the plans that God wants to do for that person's life. So Satan initiates, let me harm Job, and God says, okay, because that harmonizes with what I want to do in Job's life. Satan is the initiator. God simply allows it. David is hunted by Saul in the desert. Saul initiates this evil act. God says, that harmonizes with the character building that I want to do in David's life, so I'm going to let that happen. The best example of this is the Pharisees of Israel want to kill Jesus. And God says that harmonizes with what I want to take place for the plan of my Son and the salvation of the world. So I'll allow that to take place. It's the sinless use of sinful acts. Sometimes we ourselves are the person who initiates the evil act, and God lets us do it. Proverbs says that if you're lazy, God will let you experience the harm of not having enough money. Who started that? I did. God didn't stop it. In order that good would happen, I'd learned that laziness is not the way to go. The companions of fools suffers harm, Proverbs says. The Corinthian Christians who get drunk in the church service, God says, you're weak and sick. Some of you have died. You initiated the evil, and I did it so that you would learn this is the wrong choice to make. So, no, God did not cause the brothers to sell Joseph down to Egypt. It came into their heads, and like a vicious dog on a leash, God held them there and allowed them to harm Joseph, not in the initial way, though. He held them back from killing him. They wanted to kill him. God says, no. And then they came up with the idea, well, let's sell him instead to this caravan. And God says, yes, I'll let you do that. Not because he's unfaithful, but because God is harmonizing this evil act with the lifetime plan that I have for Joseph. And I'm going to let it take place for Joseph's good. That's what was going on here. And it's the same for you and me too. What is God's lifetime plans for you? You don't know what they are. But I'll tell you this, it includes allowing people to mistreat you. God's lifetime plan is to include some people to mistreat you. And that's not because he approves of it. He tells people, love each other, don't treat each other badly. But sometimes when someone has an evil desire to do to you, God will say, I will allow that to take place because that harmonizes with the lifetime plan I have for you. And I'm going to let it happen in order to make you strong and do you good in the end. That's what happened. Whatever God allows into your life, he allows to make you stronger and to work out the life plan that he has for you. Joseph recognized that. And it helped him be calm as he stood before his brothers. He says, yeah, you did evil. But God sent me here. God sent me here. God sent me here. And so I'm not full of rage toward you. Can you do that with the person who mistreated you? You may be very tempted to blame them, hold them accountable, be bitter about them, be depressed about things. Realize God allowed you to be mistreated because of a life plan that he's trying to work in you. That's what he wants to do, to free you, to make you stronger. Can you view your hardship that way? God wants you to do that. Well, this was Joseph's first life skill for managing the mistreatment, seeing that God was working it all for good. Let's turn one more time in your Bibles. Turn to chapter 50. Chapter 50. Many years have gone by chapter 50. Joseph has moved his entire family down to Egypt. They're all living there now. And by chapter 50, it's 17 years later from when his brothers learned who he was. 17 years later, and Jacob, their father, dies. And once Jacob dies and the funeral is over, the brothers break out into a panic. Look at 50, verse 15. Chapter 50, verse 15. When Joseph's brothers saw that their father was dead, they said, "What if Joseph bears a grudge against us and pays us back in full for all the wrongs which we did to him?" So it's 17 years later, and now they're worried. He was just holding back because Dad was alive. Now what's going to happen to us? And so look at verse 16. So they sent a message to Joseph saying, "Your father charged before he died, saying, 'Thus you shall say to Joseph, please forgive, I beg you, the transgressions of your brothers and their sin, for they did you wrong. And now please forgive the transgressions of the servants of the God of your father.' And Joseph wept when they spoke to him. Then his brothers also came and fell down before him and said, 'Behold, we are your servants, your slaves.'" Wow. They said that their father had them deliver this message after he died, it wouldn't be surprising if they made that up. They just didn't want to get in trouble. Either way, Joseph's reaction showed how he really felt. What he broke out into weeping, that they offered to be his slaves. They're his brothers. And they said, we'll be your slaves, just don't hurt us. And he urges them to truly believe that he forgave them and comforts them. Look at verse 19. Joseph said to them, "Do not be afraid, for am I in God's place? As for you, you meant evil against me, but God meant it for good in order to bring about this present result, to preserve many people alive. So therefore, do not be afraid. I will provide for you and your little ones." So he comforted them and spoke kindly to them. What an amazing man. Here's a second life skill that Joseph shows for how to grow strong after mistreatment. Number 2, choose forgiveness of the past. That sees God making right all wrongs. Choose forgiveness of the past that sees God making right all wrongs. How could Joseph simply forgive all the evil that was going on, that they had done to him? How could he do that? He says, verse 19, look at verse 19. He says, am I in God's place? What does he mean by that? Well, God's place is what? He's the judge. He's the one who settles right and wrongs. He takes all the wrongs and he brings justice to them. He says, am I in that place? No, I'm not in that place. What is Joseph's place? Joseph's place is to forgive, to let it go and never bring it up against them again. And he knew his place, and he knew God's place. It wasn't vengeance, it was forgiveness. That's really unnatural. That's not a normal thing to do. And that too clearly happened years before he's meeting with his brothers here. Years before he had decided to let them off the hook for what they did and not bring it up against them. Instead of holding it against them, he says, that's not my place. That's God's job. If he had not forgiven them, he would not have met them with kindness and consideration. He would have met them with rage and fury and how dare you. But he had forgiven. What about you? We've all been mistreated. What have you done with that mistreatment? There are only really 2 choices that we can do whenever someone mistreats us. One is to hold on to it, and the other is to let go of it. That's really the only 2 choices we can make. Your choice determines whether your heart's going to be full of emptiness and bitterness or whether it's going to be full of life. You choose to hold on to it, you're just going to know bitterness and rage and fury inside you over how you were wrong, and it'll poison your whole life. Or letting go of it, and now your life can be filled with moving on, leaving the past in the past, not dragging it up into the present constantly, and letting it go, and never bringing it up against the person again. And that fills you with light and life and hope instead of darkness of the past. But you say, Pastor, if I do that, that means the person gets away with it. Forgiveness is letting the other person off your hook. It doesn't have anything to do with God's hook. Remember, that's God's place. You're just letting them off your hook. God's place is justice, to give every person what they have earned. And that means the people who have mistreated you will stand before God and give an account for what they've done. If they're non-Christian, they will be punished for what they did to you. If they're a Christian, Christ already took the punishment, but there will be loss for the person, the Christian. God tells us there will be loss at the judgment seat of Christ. Now, forgiving a person does not mean that the pain will immediately go away. Sometimes the pain diminishes over time. Sometimes it doesn't. And every time you think about it, it causes great pain. Forgiveness does not mean the pain's going to go away. Forgiveness does not mean that the other person will change. They may be the same wicked person after you forgive them. Forgiveness also does not mean that you are necessarily done forgiving, because memories come back, and every time that memory comes back and knocks on your door to try to get back in there and you to hold it against them, you're going to have to recommit to what you did. I chose to let them off the hook and never bring it up against them again. And forgiveness doesn't mean that you don't set boundaries with the person. Forgiveness does not mean trust. Okay? Trust is earned. And if that person has betrayed you and mistreated you, you are right to set boundaries so that they don't mistreat you again in the future. Yes, you forgive them, you let them off the hook, but that doesn't mean you move blindly forward and pretend like nothing happened. If the person has been mistreating you, you have to set boundaries to protect yourself. If you have been the victim of abuse or domestic violence, number one, get to safety. Friends, family, church members, get to safety. Then as you work through this process, forgive them from your heart, let them off the hook for what they've done, but then set boundaries as you work through healing the relationship. But you don't want to, forgiveness does not mean you don't set boundaries. You set appropriate boundaries. But it's crucial. Joseph's second life skill was choosing forgiveness of the past that sees God as dealing with righting the wrongs. He'll deal with it. That's not my part. My part is to let go of it. His part is justice. Mine is forgiveness. And how serious is God that we do that? Remember, if you don't forgive, he won't forgive you. If you don't let the person off the hook for what they've done, God's not going to let you off the hook for what you've done. So you go in him to prayer, and he's going to say, I'm not going to deal with answering your prayers until you forgive. I'm not going to bless your life. I'm not going to give you guidance. I'm not going to give you healing. I'm not going to give you the things that you are seeking from me until you deal with that unforgiveness. I'm going to continue to hold your sins against you. There'll be a wall of separation between you and me. I'm not kicking you out of the family, but there's a wall breaking our fellowship here until you deal with that forgiveness. So God is very serious about it. And that's what Joseph did. So here's the life, amazing life of Joseph. I really look forward to meeting Joseph because he's been such an example to all of us through all the centuries of how to handle mistreatment the right way and not be destroyed or victimized by his mistreatment, but elevated and made stronger by responding the right way to it. So 2 lessons that we need to learn. Number 1, are you choosing hope for the future after your mistreatment? Or are you letting that, pull you down, say, nope, I'll never be the same. I'll never have that thing back again. My life will never be the same. But instead, are you saying, no, my future is bright because God has allowed this to happen. God is the one who moved in with this. Yes, it was a sinful choice, but God is using that sinful choice to work his plan out for my life. So it's not a dark, ugly end that I'm headed for. It was a dark, ugly experience, but I'm headed to a bright place. Can you redefine your experience so that it ends in a good spot? That'll bring you hope. That'll bring you light into your life. The lie is that your life has been ruined permanently by this. The truth is God is saying, if you respond the right way, your life will get better. Respond the right way. Have that hope in you for the future. Every time that lie comes, kill it. That it's destroyed your life. It may have brought you a lot of grief and loss, but God says, no, it'll be great things. So respond the right way. Number 2, are you choosing forgiveness of the past that sees as God righting this wrong? The person did not get away with it. That's the lie that you have to kill. They did not get away with it. They will be held accountable. Your part is to let them off the hook and never bring it up again. And what makes that fair? That's unfair. What makes that fair is that Jesus has let you off the hook for everything that you've done of an entire lifetime. He's saying, I want you to go and do that for the much smaller thing that person has done to you. And that makes it fair. Is there anyone in your life you're holding on to what they did to you? Let it go to them. And don't bring it up against them again. That's the way to grow strong through this. So these were the 2 life skills, and it occurred to me as I was thinking about this that these are like a teeter-totter. You have mistreatment, and you can respond with unforgiveness. I'm not going to let go of this. I'm going to hold on to what they did to me. And all that accomplishes is hopelessness in your life. It leaves that dark experience right here in your face. You're not letting it go off down into the past. You're keeping it here. Keep pulling it back into the present. It just brings hopelessness and despair and sorrow into your life. But if you do the opposite is to let go. You let go and you forgive. Well, now you have great hope because now you can move beyond it. And you can see God was involved in this. And even though it was an evil thing, God allows it because it harmonizes with the plan he has for my life to bring me into a better place, a stronger place. So in other words, you can't have great hope and unforgiveness. You got to let go. And when you do, you can have great hope that moves forward. We've all been mistreated, but not everyone's moving forward. Make sure you're moving forward today by letting go of it, not bringing it up again. What is God's lifetime plan for you? You don't know all the answers to that, but you do know that one of his plans is to let people mistreat you, not to destroy you. God doesn't approve of it. But sometimes an evil plan will come along, evil desire, an evil act will come along, and God will say, I'm going to let that through my screening process, and I'm going to let it hurt your life. But I'm doing it in faithfulness. I'm doing it because your life plan this harmonizes with that life plan, and it'll move you forward if you respond the right way. If you respond the right way. Make sure you're responding the right way. And you can be strong too, like Joseph did.